I do struggle to see how it's anything other than devastating to think through. Okay, love, basically, it's this experience we have. It doesn't really map onto anything transcendent. And then ultimately, it's all just going to grind to a halt. And the temporariness of all that is human is very significant. Sartre said, once you've lost eternity, it doesn't matter whether you have 5 minutes or I can't remember his other time, but it was a much longer scale of time. I resonate with that. To me, it's like writing a poem in ink that's going to vanish in 5 minutes. No matter how beautiful this poem is that I'm writing, the poem isn't going to stay. So it robs something fundamental. It takes away something that is at the heart of the human experience. And that's the other piece of this, is justice and the desire for good to defeat evil. The sense that there's something meaningful beyond just a biological reaction in your brain to the struggle between good and evil.
I would love to speak to some of the things you said there, because we haven't really talked about death yet. And to be clear, I was conceding that I understand from the believer standpoint that things like love and morals are diminished. I actually don't think in general, knowing that it's rooted in biology is diminishing. I think my particular love of music is also rooted in biology, but the feeling and the effect that it has on me, where I can still have a sense of awe and wonder, which I do not think is regulated to the realm of the supernatural. You know, it doesn't take anything away from like, oh, there's no heavenly composer, therefore music isn't as sweet. I do think that, you know, you and I might not be able to agree there, but I just wanted to kind of set that standard there. Secondly, in terms of like this infinite versus finite, and you know, your example of the poem, I think is great. You don't think that there's any value then in the 5 minutes of creating something that hasn't existed before and having it for yourself for a minute, even if it does flutter away, that moment didn't matter unless there's almost like this other unconnected infinity coming after. And I know I'm asking you a question, so hold there for a second. But like an example I have is my love for my wife. Under a Christian worldview, that's a good thing, and it's given by God. But, and you'll have to tell me if you think differently about heaven. I know that you know about my heaven video, and I had my conversation with Trent Horn about it, and he told me that it wouldn't be an issue for my wife in heaven that I'm not there, because it was a disordered hierarchy of purpose and love that, you know, was only for this plane, but in that realm, in heaven, in the infinity we will have, we weren't going to be married in heaven anyways. And there are higher ordered goods and all of these things. And you don't have to defend Trent's point or heaven in general. But I'm just saying that even in a Christian belief, that would not still exist in the next life. So therefore, doesn't that make it as meaningless as the 5-minute poem? And so for you to answer the question that I'm asking, I think it's even with an afterlife of sorts, and that's only assuming the good afterlife for people, not the consequence. Doesn't that also make so much of what happens here utterly meaningless, or just us subjectively finding meaning and entertainment, love, etc., why we're here? How do you parse that out?
That's a good question. I agree with you that this can be overstated, and that there is value in that which is fleeting and temporary. So I don't mean to say that there is no value of any kind in the 5-minute poem, nor that a 10-minute poem wouldn't be better. You know, so you can enjoy the poem for 10 minutes. Great. Awesome. I think though, the reason the Camus uses the word absurd, it's a technical term though, but he's trying to get at this sense of mismatch between the human heart and our setting and what we long for and what is out there. I think we all have the sense that love and justice matter in a way that is fundamentally undermined if you lose also that enduring component. So for example, to take love, for example, if we really think it through, that when I am loving another person, it is just my brain. Actually, it is a kind of illusion, because to the extent that I feel that this is significant, it is my brain chemistry acting upon me in the way that like a rich dessert is acting upon my brain. And there are reasons why we evolved in such a way that a dessert affects us like this. With morality, I would say that in a strictly naturalistic framework, it is both illusion and accident. So for example, we could have evolved such that our closest, most fundamental relationships would be ones in which it is morally obligatory to slaughter each other at a certain point. Rather, that's what happens in the animal kingdom a lot. So Charles Darwin himself talked about this, and in the literature, these are called Darwinian counterfactuals. It's this idea that basically, just like many other animals, there's all kinds of things we just consider absolutely disgusting, horrifying. I don't even want to mention them. A lot of them are in the insect realm. But it's like, we could have evolved to see that as noble and good. And I would say that it's, oh boy, I have to say it strongly, I guess. I think it's way more than just diminishing to make that adjustment. I think it's very difficult to actually, I understand what you're saying of, yeah, it doesn't take away the momentary experience. You can still enjoy music even if there's no musician in heaven. Right there and then you can do so. But what I also feel is that most of us have a sense that it can't be just that. And if it is just that, then I think it does feel as devastating as the existentialist noted. Because if you lose any sense of enduring value to love and morality, I mean, you put the contrast like this. Either there's a judgment day or there isn't. If there is a judgment day, then it matters in a way that is basic and fundamental, whether you lived your life as a dictator who slaughtered people or whether you lived your life like a saint who built hospitals. It matters in a way that will literally ripple on forever. Without the idea of Judgment Day, it honestly will only matter for a short amount of time. It still matters for that amount of time, but then it just stops. Now, you can say, yes, in that second alternative, I still appreciate the finite value of that. I'm not denying that. But I also am insisting that there's a pretty fundamental difference between those two. And that it's not wrong when the existentialists are coming along saying, hey, like Sartre saying, once you've lost eternity, whether it's 5 minutes or 5 million years, makes no difference, is what he says. Because the loss is literally infinite. I do say that is devastating. And I do say that if justice and love are reducible to biology like that, yeah, the difference is, I would say, it's not just diminishing. I would say the differences are quite literally infinite in their implications, so far as I can see.
I just disagree with the righteousness or the judgment, which I know sounds absurd to you, but I do. I don't see that the slaughtering of all of these people, as the example you gave, would somehow be better if that person, when they get to judgment, goes to hell, or they've accepted Jesus as their savior and now they go to paradise, where many of their victims didn't have a chance to know or thought differently, believed differently, whatever, and now they're in hell. That doesn't feel like justice to me, and I know that gets us into a whole new realm of the conversation, and I'm not trying to put you in a spot where you need to defend it right now, but I'm saying with understandings like that, problems of evil, problems of suffering, problems with hell, etc., it doesn't then become the solution to the atheist who has those ideas that it sounds like when you just say it, like, oh, if God exists, then isn't it better? If there is an ultimate sense of justice at the end, then that makes up for some of these things. I just fundamentally disagree. In fact, almost to the opposite completely, where there's beauty in the finitude of things, that there is an urgency. You keep talking about what Sartre initially saw with this great divorcing from religion, but his conclusion was a radical freedom that equaled a radical responsibility. As he goes on to note how important it is that if we are all we have, all we can do is bear up under that and do well with it. And that radical freedom, radical responsibility, that's what I see in The Noble Revolt from Camus. That's what I see in Any Why Gets You Through Any Suffering with Nietzsche. It's all the understanding of, yes, it is traumatic to lose it, but it doesn't mean we can't build, and now we actually should build, and we can, and it could look like this or like that. And you get into all these different ideas philosophically. But I think that before you can say that a judgment day matters or makes things better because it sometimes for some of us fits this desire we have, I don't even see that desire is necessarily beneficial. And without opening a can of worms, I'll speak for one more minute, but to help you understand my point of view here, I am a determinist. I don't believe in free will. And so I do believe that most of us in most regards are products of our time and place and 1,000 happenstances that came before us. And so though I don't like when someone causes harm, and I think there should be consequence, My goal into that consequence would be rehabilitation, or at least you're being removed from causing more harm. But it's still with an understanding of that person being subject to things that were probably awful for them and passing it along. And yes, we need to stop it. We still need the responsibility of that. But to me, that changes my sense of justice, just like it changed my sense of like prison reform. Like punishment seems so small to me. Hell then seems so small to me if it doesn't allow at all for rehabilitation. And it is truly this vengeance, which I think has a much more incorrectly negative associated term. So just quickly, like you threw a kitchen sink, I threw a kitchen sink. We're all trying to do it so fast. But those are some of like my initial thoughts where I just can't get on board with even that being a better solution. Your
comments about punishment, I think I'm going to just hit the pause on that and not respond to that at all or first. I could mention, I think C.S. Lewis has some at least interesting thoughts about sort of punishment versus remedial healing type behavior which is actually fairer and better for a wrongdoer. And so if somebody wants to sort through that, I think he's at least worth engaging with. He probably does a better job than other Christians at trying to explain how punishment isn't maybe as cruel as it might seem. I'm not saying he's right, but I just want to reference that. I think on the main points you said, I'm tracking with your thought process, I think. Maybe a question I could ask is about moral obligation. So the idea that it really is, you really ought not to do some things, even if it's not conducive to your well-being one way or the other. Like, so if I say you ought to brush your teeth, the reason for that is so you don't get cavities and have bad teeth and so forth. But if I say you ought not to steal from your neighbor when you need more money to pay your taxes, that's a different rationale for the appeal. So that's what I'm getting at with the phrase moral obligation. Mm-hmm. To my mind, the loss, that's one aspect of morality I find very difficult to ground in a strictly naturalistic worldview, which is one species of atheism. And I would say that is devastating. So like, for example, you mentioned, we go through this trauma with a loss of a religious framework, but then we can rebuild from there. So in that rebuilding, some people believe in individual human rights, some people don't. Are we morally obligated to have societies that affirm individual human rights? Is that morally obligatory? I'm curious how you'd answer that. If I were an atheist, I would be very hard pressed to know how to really say to the person who doesn't believe in individual human rights, you're wrong to not believe in them. I could say I don't like that. I don't think that's best. But I don't see where this sense of moral obligation comes in that framework. It's another one of those areas where I see the loss, and I'm not trying to compare it to, I understand you're saying we don't want to compare it too quickly to Christianity.
I think it's part of the conversation, though, because you are saying there is something offered that's better. And one question I'd have for you, and I will answer your moral questions here too, but just so it's on the table for us to discuss is, even having an answer versus having the answer, or even something that seems more livable to you as opposed to equaling truth. Like at what point does truth come in? But we can table that and just stick on like the practicality of the belief or non-belief. So did you want me to just speak to the moral point or I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off there.
Well, I feel bad that I don't have as much time as we both would like. So I'm happy for you to decide. You can either answer that or I can answer your question, whatever you prefer.
I agree. And not to use this term again, it is emotionally unsatisfying not to get to say, this is the way it ought to be. I understand the human dilemma. I'm with you on all of it. I just also don't think that we get that from a Christian worldview. So I think that's something to contend with. There is a claim of objective morality, but I don't see that acted out in everyday life. I see just as much subjectivity. If I got 100 Christians in a room, I'd get 100 different answers on the abortion debate or trans issues or homosexuality or the death penalty or prison reform. Like, again, if there is an objective morality, especially with a promise of a witness of a Holy Spirit acting on our heart with wisdom and discernment, that looks even more problematic to me from a Christian worldview than just being honest that, to my degree, being honest that, hey, it is not fun to not be able to say one should always do X, but that there are things we can still ground, not objectively, morality in. And to me, my understanding of morality now past belief is that it's a skill. It's a skill that has allowed us to coexist, to live in community, to evolve. Even if you want to get evolutionary with it and talk about from a selfish perspective, you need go no further than that I don't want people doing this to me. So I don't want to live in a society that will reward when that happens. And thus I need to be part of that society that also abides by those laws and in accordance of trying to have well-being amongst as many people as possible from kind of a utilitarianism point of view, that maybe there should be a collective agreement of what laws we dictate under, and people that, to some degree, like I understand there's not that objective sense of this is how you tell people, but we do that. We create, just like in my opinion, Christians have created a code or a rule or a law, and we ground it in what we can, empathy or selfishness. I think they go hand in hand actually to a certain degree in this matter. And Christians are grounding it in a claim of there being a higher presence that actually gave it to them and wrote it on their heart. And I don't see them that different. I think it sucks to a degree that it is indeed subjective, but it is so for everybody. And until the Christian worldview actually put forward an immutable set of laws that were agreed upon, like I don't even see there being a benefit in the claim that Christianity or religion or God belief offers an objective morality. So those are my quick thoughts on it. And I know it's pulling from two strings. I'm trying to answer you, but I'm also saying why it failed for me as a believer, because I was a believer for 30 years. I don't know how much you know about me. I'm married to a believer. So this is part of my everyday life. I'm very aware. But yeah, it's just emotionally unsatisfying, but it doesn't change the truth of it. And so all we can do is, under what I perceive to be the correct truth, do the best we can. And a lot of great modern philosophers and even ancient philosophers have put forward really good reasons for what we still owe each other and why morality is a skill and has a purpose to play, and how we've come to those conclusions. Let me
just, let's go 10 minutes longer than what I initially said, because I think this is a really good conversation. One thing I'd like to say is maybe what we could do is take Christianity off the table for a second, because that is a more localized, specific option than what is initially framed with my video of atheism. Sure. I think whether or not Christians have shared agreements about morality or something like that, it's kind of a second step or third step or more. The first step is if God exists. Now, one thing I want to say is, whether or not theists even all agree about morality, I do regard that as a completely different question as to whether morality itself is objective. And I feel really strongly about this because I see this come up over and over again, and I do think there's a misunderstanding that often comes up here where we are talking about the ontology of morality. We're not talking about its epistemology, how it is known, its sociology, how it develops in societies. All of that is totally a separate question. It's relevant, it's interesting, but the question is, what is there out there to ground good and evil? And even if every theist in the world had a completely different moral framework, that wouldn't invalidate whether theism grounds morality and gives an ontological framework for that. So I would say when someone, I've been mistreated in my life at times, not as bad as some others, but I know what it feels like when that sense of violation, somebody mistreats you. I think we all know what that feels like. When that happens, there's a question that comes up, and that is, what am I feeling here? What am I experiencing? Is that anything more than the way sugar affects my brain? Is there anything out there? Is there something that gives a sort of robust skeletal structure to good and evil, from which we can then argue and at least do our best to figure it out? And so your question of at what point does truth come in? What is interesting to me as a Christian is to think about that feeling of violation, of moral violation, and the anger, the injustice, the sense of indignation. Somebody vandalizes my car or something like this. I'm going to feel a certain way about that. We all know what that's like. We don't feel like moral relativists in that moment. We really feel like this is wrong. You should not do that. A feeling of obligation comes up. When I'm holding my son back in 2013, and I feel this way about all my kids, a feeling happens. Now, when truth comes in is when I say, can I trust that feeling? Is it basically my brain tricking me? Because I think Michael Ruse and the others who talk about this are right when they say there is a sense of an illusory nature to these experiences from a strictly evolutionary framework. They're there to help us survive, but they're not actually the feeling they deliver doesn't map on to anything outside of that biological triggering in our brain. So the question that then comes up is, are those experiences, moral violation, this transcendent feeling of love, could they be windows into truth? Are they tricks? Are they illusions? Or are they revelations? And I would say I've come to see them as revelatory, which is one of the greatest reliefs and points of happiness in my life, that I don't have to be at cross purposes with my deep intuitions about love and about beauty. And I don't have airtight arguments, but I do have some arguments that at least make it rational to believe that there's also truth to the idea of the supernatural. And I mentioned the contingency and fine-tuning arguments. I think these are pretty good. I honestly do. I think they're pretty good arguments. They're not airtight. They don't, especially the contingency one is so abstract. I understand if people don't like that argument. But the fine-tuning one, man alive, that one is tough to get around. It's a pretty good argument that there's something. It doesn't prove God per se, but it's like, hey, it's not crazy to think that there's something that stands behind the physical realm that sort of intended it to be here, and that's why it's so incredibly intricate and precise and so forth. So I have additional arguments that get the truth, but I experience those arguments with a sense of relief, because they enable me to not look at my feeling of injustice, at my car vandalized, my feeling of love, and I don't have to look at those and be suspicious that it's just my brain chemistry tricking me. I can say, actually, the sense that there is something of abiding significance to this outside of my biology might actually be a clue rather than a trick.
The problem I have with, because I do understand what you're saying. I'm trying to hear you very clearly. It does feel like there's these leaps that do happen in these kinds of conversations from, well, first, is it practical? Second, how do I feel about it? If how I feel about it is unsatisfactory to me, does that mean that potentially there's more? Oh, and then look, there are these good arguments for God, and that gets us to a God. And then I've got my specific arguments to get to my deity of choice. And I'm not saying that what you're doing is necessarily, incorrect in these jumps, but I do feel like evaluating them each on their own changes the conversation drastically. And that's why I keep using the word emotionally unsatisfying, because I think it's the counter to, well, I feel so deeply with this awe or this emotion or this love, and I would hate for it to just be neurons firing or oxytocin releasing, some chemical makeup that it is reduced to. And so therefore, you mentioned the Blaise Pascal quote about, could you say it for me one more time? I forget the exact word. You referenced it a few times in your video.
I quote Pascal so much that I forget which one it was.
Oh, you said it even in this conversation. Yeah, just having
diversions.
Yeah, and I actually see those diversions to be when you're faced with the reality of what you can't know, or what it looks like it is, that it is just biology, and that seems unsatisfying. We create the diversions to not deal with those tough feelings. See, again, I think we go past each other here, because I think that jumping to God belief, and even if you have good arguments, and I would disagree about fine-tuning and contingency being good arguments, but even if you really are convinced of those, it doesn't all of a sudden just give permission to have looked for diversion in the first place because something didn't feel good or right, or that something seems to be at odds with, what you mentioned earlier, like your heart versus the reality of the situation. So I understand, and I'm agnostic at a large degree. If these deep emotions and awe and love and things like this that feel transcendent end up being rooted in something bigger, great. In terms of the specific God claims, that's where my atheism kicks in, and I see reasons why they're falsifiable, and so that doesn't do it for me. And since deism at large isn't provable either or negatable, then it's just like, well, let me stick with what I do know and not keep trying to jump just because I don't know feels so bad. And I really believe that that's so much of what these arguments are, because when we look at atheists and we look at more atheist societies and we see that they are living well and that it's, they are capable of still raising children and being moral and living and loving, which I know you've agreed with, I don't see the problem, and I feel like it's only a problem created by believers to reinforce belief, if not even sometimes, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, fear-mongering a bit so that people don't leave. If you do, it's unlivable, it's horrible, like it gets reduced down to biology. Like, these things are framed in a way where I think that's why we have the existentialist dread, because we're leaving something that always told us that, as opposed to, I've talked with so many people that didn't have my experience, that were raised atheistic, that never had a particular God belief. And they don't struggle with that to the same degree. Of course, they still wonder about meaning and purpose and like, if does anything happen after we die? But to a large degree, when you poll people, even religious, I'll throw one more stat out and then we can talk about this. But there was a Pew Research stat that just came out, and it was an open-ended question this time. And it was, what gives your life meaning? And only 15%, this blew my mind, but only 15% of believers, and I know you're just hearing a stat, well, due diligence, everyone check. I'll put a link to it. But 15% of people in the US listed religion or God or faith or anything like that. For the vast majority, it was family, friends, work, connection, etc. And then in less religious countries, it was down under 5% where people put that. So obviously, people to me are able to find meaning, and you would say yes, of course, but it's not objective, and that reduces it. But they don't see it that way. That's what they're claiming is their meaning. They have purpose in the same way you feel you do, and love in the same way you do. So getting into like where does it stem from really, I think is only a problem for believers by believers to a certain degree. So I just wanted to kind of get that point of view out there, because I think that it plays into it a lot. But sorry for the diatribe.
Okay. All good. No problem. Your comment about sort of leaps in my thinking is probably more a reflection of how I unfolded my last set of comments than how I, in my actual life, have come to these conclusions.
Sure.
So, and I think there's a slight delay. So if I ever either interrupt or awkwardly pause before I talk, it's because of the technology too. But so I think, cause as I experience it, I would say it's a two-pronged approach that I actually think is somewhat harmonious, where on the one hand, I actually think in certain conditions, our deep intuitions can have epistemic value. And, that's controversial within epistemology, but that's a view I could take. But then I would say that works. So in other words, like my moral intuitions. But I would say that works in tandem with these other arguments, which I know aren't our focus here, so I won't go into them. But I do think there's some pretty good reasons that make theism really plausible. But to speak to the main point that we're talking about now, you've used the word unsatisfying, emotionally unsatisfying, whereas I use the stronger term devastating. I think devastating is definitely a stronger adjective than unsatisfying. And then in your most recent comments there, you were unfolding some concerns about sort of, this is something believers can almost sort of exaggerate and make into a matter of fear mongering and so on and so forth. Let me just explain why I disagree and see what you think about this. I wonder if to some extent our ability to even talk about this in such a dispassionate, objective way is a function of the privilege of living in the 21st century in such a prosperous society. Because throughout most of human history, we would have lived in constant fear that the neighboring clan is going to come over, rape our women, steal our children and make them slaves, slaughter us, make us into slaves, just completely butcher us and do whatever they want and do what the worst of what human nature can do. And if we lose the ability to say that is, you are obligated not to do that. You should not do that. It is wrong. It actually matters that you not do that. If we lose the ability to say there is actual genuine moral obligation, that is not, that to me, that is absolutely devastating. I worry, to be honest, I worry that not seeing it as devastating may be a function of we don't live in that fear and we don't have to face that battle as much. Because if there is no obligation against such behavior, then okay, we can talk about sort of having some sense of love and so forth in the moment. That's not enough. To have a functioning society, I think there needs to be a more robust sense of morality. So, I don't know. Would you agree that there is no moral obligation against that kind of clan-like behavior? Can you see how an adjective like devastating can come in as we envision this kind of prospect?
I promise you I'm not trying to do whataboutism or anything like that, but it is part of my actual answer because I left one and I'm here now, and part of the leaving was for this reason that you're bringing up, just in the opposite direction. When I do think it's important to be able to understand that these things, that there are bad things, and I want as many people to agree that those things are bad. I want that. I don't have an objective grounding to give them. I think I have many cases that can still be made and have been made about why we should. The problem is that I never have seen deism, theism, a particular Abrahamic faith that it's grounded in that and then it doesn't exist. Not to get into it, but Yahweh commands his clan to attack other clans and wipe them out. And you will say, yes, but there was this ultimate purpose, or, might makes right. He gets to be the arbiter of those things. Understood. But every theistic society who puts their God, giving them the special permission when it changes, means that we still result in having these things. And I think it's actually a much harder moral hill to climb, to constantly try to say whose God is right, whose God is real, which version of that God or that God belief is the correct one in terms of how we should act or how we should treat each other, which does go back to my earlier point about if it's not actually practically better in the claim of God belief to give objective morals, then I don't see us needing to jump that barrier of truth to me or of emotional significance to say, well, if you believe in God, you can say this is bad, but then you can also be the person that does it and justify it. And I understand where we'll disagree on that and that we technically have 5 minutes left, even on our extended schedule. But to me, that is the answer, is that, hey, they're both hard moral hills to climb. You have to still get people to agree, saying that if the whole world was Christian, there would be no war, anything like that. And not that you're saying that, but I don't see any version of an objective morality playing out where those things no longer happen, or where it's said that they're always bad. Because for every single moral issue, I can think of multiple times that Yahweh has commanded it or did it himself. Speaking again to the Christian belief, but we could do that for other gods and other belief systems. And that's more unsatisfying and more devastating to me. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Chris, Greysteel, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Lori, Matthew, and Perry; my Humanist heroes, Chris, James, Jarrod, and Kristi; my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jugs, Julie, Melissa, Paul, Rege, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons and new Mindshifter members. Thank you so much for your support. It means more than you can ever know.